Good afternoon. Welcome to this first lecture in our Humanities lecture series hosted by the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, ISOBOK in 2023. Today it is our great pleasure to welcome Professor Upinder Singh, who is going to deliver this lecture. And thank you, Upinder, for being here. We're very grateful. So just a brief peek into Upinder's very illustrious academic career. She's currently Professor of History at Ashoka University. She taught at St. Stephen's College and subsequently in the History Department at the University of Delhi. After her BA in History from St. Stephen's College, she obtained her MA and MPhil from the University of Delhi, followed by a PhD from McGill University, Montreal. She has received fellowships to conduct research in Leiden, Cambridge, Harvard, and other places. In 2009, she was awarded the Infosys Prize in Social Sciences in History. Upinder's writings range over various aspects of ancient Indian social, economic, and religious history, the intersection between political ideas and practice, Indian archaeology, modern histories of ancient sites and monuments, and cultural interactions between India and Southeast Asia. Her research has been published in various Indian and international journals. She is the author of many important books. Just to name a few: Political Violence in Ancient India, The Idea of Ancient India, Essays on Religion, Politics, and Archaeology, A History of Ancient and Early Medieval India from the Stone Age to the 12th century, The Discovery of Ancient India, Early Archaeologists and the Beginnings of Archaeology, and the list goes on. So her current research interests include the history of ideas and Asian interactions in the pre-modern world. So with that, I think I will hand over to Upinder, and thank you again for being here, and we look forward to your talk.
Is the mic working? Yes. Give me a minute to just. So I'd like to, at the outset, thank Dr. Aditi Singh and Dr. Amandita Pan and the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences of ISOBOK, because I've heard so much about this institution. It's the first time I'm coming here. And it's wonderful to meet the faculty and also meet you students. So thank you very much. Now, the 5 centuries between the Maurya and Gupta empires, circa 200 BCE to 300 CE, saw many momentous historical developments. You know, sometimes this has been seen as a dark age, but whether you look at these centuries from the point of view of political history, social history, economic, religious, cultural history, these are extremely important centuries. On the political front, there were a series of invasions from the northwest. Cities and states appeared in many regions, including the Deccan and the far south. Craftspersons produced larger quantities and more varied goods than before. Trade within the subcontinent and with Central Asia, China, Southeast Asia, and the Mediterranean flourished. And money was increasingly used as a medium of exchange. Political ideology was expressed through coinage, and kings increasingly marked their power on their realm through inscribed words, images, and monuments. New literary forms such as kavya were patronized by urban elites. New cultural winds blew into India in the wake of the invasions and flourishing trade. And the Northwest in particular became a major cultural crossroads. bhakti or devotion became an important element in religious life across sectarian and cultic boundaries, and the worship of images in shrines became a cornerstone of religious practice. The increasing institutionalization of religious activity was reflected in religious texts, structures, images, and inscriptions. Sophisticated styles of stone sculpture emerged and coexisted with vibrant traditions of terracotta art. A great deal of our evidence pertains to the rapidly growing Buddhist establishments, but we also have evidence related to Puranic Hinduism and Jainism and many religious beliefs and practices which are difficult to fit into the standard religious categories or isms. I'm going to discuss two sites, Sanchi and Nagarjunakonda. I thought Sanchi would be interesting because it's so close to you. You must have been there. If you haven't been there, you better go there as soon as you can. And I want to highlight the role of interpretation in archaeology, the gap between normative texts and religious practice, the diversity of religious landscapes, and the importance of material evidence in reconstructing the history of Buddhism in early historic India. Let me start by saying something about the discovery, excavation, and conservation of Sanchi. The site was discovered by one General Taylor in 1818, and many stupas of the area were opened, documented, and damaged, by the way, by Alexander Cunningham and Lieutenant F.C. Gacy over several months in 1851. Restoration work was undertaken in 1881 initially, and then it was carried on a much larger scale by John Marshall between 1912 and 1919. What is less known is the fact that the Begums of Bhopal, within whose domain Sanchi fell, provided important logistical and financial support in the excavations as well as conservation work at Sanchi. We know from inscriptions that in ancient times, Sanchi was known as Kakanava, Kakanaya, Kakanava Gota, or Gota Shri Parvata. It is not far from the city of Vidisha, the ruins of which have been located at the site of Vesnagar. And Vidisha was a very important site on the trade routes of ancient India. It was also an important political center. Later Buddhist tradition talks about the love affair that the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka had with the daughter of a merchant of Vidisha. And there is a monastery outside Vidisha that is mentioned in later Buddhist texts. But the importance and magnitude of the site of Sanchi is known through monuments, sculptures, and inscriptions. And it is these monuments, sculptures, and inscriptions that give us a history of Buddhism in stone, a history that spans 15 centuries, from the 3rd century BCE to the 12th century CE. Stupas were originally funerary monuments. And the Pali text suggests that there was an older tradition of raising stupas over the funerary remains of kings. But the oldest surviving Buddhist stupas belong to the time of the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka. According to Buddhist tradition, this king distributed portions of the Buddha's relics to all the major cities of India, and that he erected 84,000 stupas. Stupa 1, which you see on screen, also known as the Great Stupa, is the most impressive of the structural remains at Sanchi. Its brick core belongs to Ashoka's time. A sandstone pillar, crowned by a lion capital, inscribed with the king's schism edict, once stood near the stupa's southern gateway, which at that time must have been made of wood. In later times, Ashoka was added to the sculptures on the gateways. This Ashokan edict at Sanchi, why has it become faded? Did I press something here?
I think it's. Is there something else on this thing? Because I can't see it.
I need to press, this is not connected. Okay, now it's all right. So there was something that connected this. All right. I don't know why this is happening.
Can you not see it? You can see it, but we can see it. Yeah.
Oh, I know why, because I have my reading glasses on, that's why. Sorry about that. The Ashokan Edict at Sanchi is a variant of the Schism Edict, of which other versions are found at Sarnath and the Allahabad Fosam Pillar. The inscription, which is in the Prakrit language and the Brahmi script, is damaged in parts and refers to the Sangha of monks and nuns having been united, and Ashok's decree that any monk or nun who caused dissension within the monastic order should be made to put on white robes and reside outside the monastery. The inscription concludes with Ashok expressing his desire that the Sangha should endure as a united body. In fact, this inscription suggests that there were serious divisions within the Buddhist Sangha in Ashok's time, and that these divisions or these disagreements among the Buddhist monks required the emperor's intervention. It also shows us the position of authority that Ashok had over the Buddhist monastic order. Between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE, Sanchi was humming with activity. Stupa 1 was encased in stone, and the ground, stairway, berm, and balustrades, and the pavement of the Pradakshina Path or the procession path, the main terraces were built. Stupas 2 and 3 were constructed. 2 of these stupas have relic caskets that are inscribed. A relic box found in Stupa 2 contained 4 caskets with bone fragments. So there's an inscription on the relic casket which gives us the names of the monks whose relics were enshrined inside that stupa. Stupa 3 contained relics in the form of bone fragments and beads. And the inscription on the relic casket informs us that the famous monks, Buddhist monks, Mahamoggallana and Sariputta, it is their relics that were enshrined here. The remains in Sanchi include pillars, residences for monks, shrines, what are known as votive stupas, these small stupas, monasteries. I'm just giving you a sense of probably structure that you've already seen, and a lot of sculptures and a very large number of inscriptions. So there are temples, halls, and hundreds of inscriptions, thanks to which we know about and know the names of the people and something of the background of the people who financed the building of this massive, major Buddhist establishment. And this monastery seems to have been a going concern till the 12th century. Now, while the beginnings of the Sanchi establishment coincide with the First Indian Empire, the later history of Sanchi has very little to do with kings or courts, and that is one of the interesting aspects of this site. So these are some of the lovely sculptures that you see at the site, but I'm going to mainly talk about these inscriptions, and hundreds of them that are found inscribed on the railings and the gateways, and on, in Ashok's case, on the pillars at Sanchi. There are over 800 inscriptions, and what the slide does is show you the breakup. There is one Ashokan inscription, there are over 800 inscriptions belonging to the period 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE, only 3 inscriptions belonging to the 2nd century, 5th to 6th centuries, 8 inscriptions, and 6th to 9th century, 2 inscriptions. So you can see this was an especially fertile period in the history of Sanchi when the Buddhist establishment expanded in a massive way. So let me tell you something about what these donated inscriptions belonging to this period tell us about the people who gave the money to build the Buddhist monastery. But before that, we have to think carefully about some basic questions. And the most basic questions, you probably agree, are the most difficult to answer. We need to understand or decide on how to read the donated inscriptions. Well, for one thing, we have to read them in their larger archaeological context in relation to the structures on which they are engraved, the larger archaeological landscape. And we also have to read these inscriptions in relation to the art remains, the sculptures that we find at the site. We can also compare the evidence from Sanchi with evidence from early Buddhist texts, the Tipitaka, the Pali Canon, was composed, there's an overlap in the period of composition of the Pali canon of Tipitaka and the Sanchi inscriptions. But this is the question, even more difficult question. Why were these inscriptions inscribed? There's nothing obvious about the answer because many of the inscriptions are engraved at places, at heights where they could not have been read. And the vast majority of the people who would have come to Sanchi would have probably been unable to read or write anyway. So why were these inscriptions inscribed? Well, to assert the donor's identity and generosity, to specify the purpose of the gift, and to give permanence by having these things engraved in stone, to give a permanence to these expressions of identity and various other religious sentiments. No doubt that is why. These are some of the reasons why these inscriptions were inscribed. So to specify the purpose of the gift, to give the donors a permanent place in the shadow of the relics, because some of the stupas had sacred relics. And in some cases, we also have a specification of who was supposed to receive the merit, the punya, that was to arise, believed to arise from the making of the gift. So these are some of the points we need to keep in mind before we leap into analyzing the data from the inscriptions. So this is how donors are variously identified. These inscriptions, by the way, most of them are really short, but because there are over 800, they are very amenable to statistical analysis. And the inscriptions identify the donors variously. Sometimes just the name is given. In terms of kinship relations, their occupation occasionally is mentioned, where they came from, their native place. In a few cases, there are references to Yavana donors, and Yavana could mean Greek or a Westerner, members of the monastic order or the laity, that is, they could be monks or nuns, bhikkhus or bhikkhunis, or they could be upasakas and upasikas, that is, members of the laity. Now, it's quite interesting that when we historians talk about the period of history after the 6th century BCE, we say that kinship relations were becoming less important, class stratification was becoming more important, varna, okay, is there, but jati or caste was becoming more important. But when you look at these inscriptions, interestingly enough, there are no references to varna and no references to jati. So this is one of those things that shows us that when you look at different kinds of historical sources, sometimes the evidence from these sources does not tally. So this is the kind of macro level picture that we get of the Sanchi donors, but let us look at some of the interesting and significant results of the analysis of these donors. Now, one is the gender aspect. Now, remember that the Sanchi monument was growing and was being patronized by a large number of women donors, and you can see the numbers, the figures there. We have 380 donations made by men, 344 donations made by women. This is where we can identify the gender of the donors. And not only are there a large number of donations made by women, there is a great visibility of women among the donors. Some women made multiple donations, so they gave more money, money in abundance. And one of the gateway inscriptions, and remember the gateways were beautifully carved, so more money would have been required to finance the making of the gateways. So there is a woman donor whose name is recorded on one of the Sanchi gateways. And of course, women are also visible and very visible and prominent in early Buddhist texts. But the degree of visibility that you see as far as women are concerned in the inscriptions of Sanchi is far greater than what you would expect if you were only to look at the Pali texts. Now remember that the time when all these women, hundreds of women, were giving money to the Sanchi monastery, this is also the period when the Manusmriti was written. Okay, there's an overlap. So if you look at gender relations and ideas about the woman's place in the family and the household, in the Manusmriti, you get a picture of women being confined to the household in a position of subordination and submissiveness, obedience. These are the kinds of qualities that are emphasized. But what you see in the Sanchi inscriptions is women playing a very active role in giving money, expressing their piety in very tangible material ways. So it's a very different picture of women's active role in society at the time that you get when you look at these inscriptions. Women are also, by the way, very prominent in Sanchi sculpture. And so you see the Shala Bhanjikas, these Yakshis, Shala Bhanjikas, you see women riding on these interesting, fantastic animals. And there are many scenes where the Buddha is being worshipped or venerated by groups of people. And usually the groups of people include both men and women. So this is certainly something that is very, very striking. So what the evidence of the inscriptions from Sanchi indicates unequivocally is that during the period between the 2nd century BCE and the 2nd century CE, a very strong element of monetary support for the building activity at Sanchi came from women. And as I said, women do appear as upasikas, as nuns in various roles. You know, the story about Sujata offering the Buddha sort of pious porridge, that sort of thing. But the degree of participation that we see in the inscriptions is quite remarkable. This is another feminine figure. Do you recognize this figure? This is from Sanchi. Anybody in the audience? Any of the students?
That's Buddha's mother or Gajalakshmi?
You're right. You know, some of the Alfred Fouché, who was one of the scholars who studied the Sanchi sculptures, felt that it was not possible to interpret this as Gajalakshmi, the goddess Lakshmi flanked by elephants. But you know, and he suggested this was really a representation of the Buddha's birth, and that this was the Buddha's mother Maya. But this iconography is so specific to Gajalakshmi that I think that is an incorrect interpretation. And in fact, you have many of these goddesses, boundary crossing goddesses. And Lakshmi is one of those goddesses who appears in many different contexts. So much feminine imagery at Sanchi. Now, another important way in which donors at Sanchi are identified or identify themselves, because they must have played a role in, you know, they must have told somebody who was involved in planning the architectural program, the sculptural program, the inscriptional program. There must have been some kind of element of order and organization in this. And so it's not just some kind of random information that we're getting. And many of them are identified in terms of their kinship relations. And interestingly, or not surprisingly, kinship relations are more often specified for women than by men. We also have evidence of donations made by large kin groups, kulas or nyatis, etc. We have evidence of the use of matronyms, men who are known as the son. You know, their name indicates, derived from the name of their mother. And then you have joint gifts by various members of the family. So although class stratification is certainly becoming more important in the Ganga Valley, clearly kinship remains a very important basis of social identity as far as the donated inscriptions are concerned. What did these people do, these people who gave all this money to the Sanchi monastery? Well, in a few cases we know. For instance, there are 12 references to Sethis. The Sethis were businessmen or bankers. 6 traders or merchants, Banesh. 4 donors are identified as Gahapatis. And Gahapati means a large landowner. 4 were lekhakas or scribes. And there are a few other references as well. So not that much evidence, unfortunately, about the background, the occupational background of the donors, But again, these are the terms that appear again and again in the Buddhist texts. I was a little disappointed that these terms occurred rather infrequently in the Sanchi inscriptions. The most frequently specified detail about donors at Sanchi is where they came from, their native place. And it is mentioned in 366 inscriptions. And when you look at the places that are mentioned and which can be identified, most of them came from the area around Sanchi, from the Malabar region. So there are donors who come from Vidisha, from Ujjayini, Koraghara, so on and so forth. And there are a few donors who came from places outside the Malabar region, one perhaps from Mount Abu, one from Pokhara or Pushkara, and also the term Govardhana, which is located in Maharashtra. It's mentioned. Apart from these three Yavanas, who I'm these days very interested in, we don't know who they were and where they lived, but whether they were Greeks or not is anybody's guess. What is significant about Sanchi is that royal patronage was not that important, except for the initial Ashokan connection. There are very few references to people connected with royal courts in these inscriptions. So I just put them down here, but the bottom line is that out of those 800 inscriptions, there are barely 4 donors who had anything to do with royal courts. So royal patronage was not important at Sanchi. This is very interesting. You see this happening only between 200 BC and the early century CE. You have people, all the people of an entire village, and all the people of a village making a gift to the Sanchi establishment, showing the great upsurge in popular support that Buddhism enjoyed in this period. We also see collective gifts of nuns. And this is important because, when we teach the history of ancient India, we make a big deal out of how the Buddha established a Sangha, a monastic order for women, although he was reluctant to do so. And that was a very important step. But we hardly know anything about the order of nuns, the Bhikkhuni Sangha, after the time of the Buddha. And clearly it declined and died out. And my theory is that the bhikkhus, the Sangha of men, had a great deal to do with the fact that the order of nuns disappeared. We also have a gift that is recorded of the ivory carvers of Vidisha on the southern gateway of Sanchi. So a lot of interesting information about the donors. I hope I'm not going too fast. Now, this is another very interesting thing, that lots of gifts were made by monks and nuns. 252 gifts made by members of the Sangha. Remember, Sangha is the Buddhist monastic order, and there is a Sangha of monks or bhikkhus and a Sangha of nuns, bhikkhunis. And again here, if you look at the numbers, 129 gifts made by monks and 123. So nuns are not too far behind as far as the donations are concerned. How do we explain this? Because according to the Pali text at least, monks and nuns are not supposed to have any property. They're supposed to be cut off from their worldly life and worldly interests. So this was something that puzzled the early scholars who found these inscriptions at Sanchi, and various theories were suggested. Maybe they went around begging for money and donated that money. Maybe they went back to their worldly existence for some time and drew on their financial family resources. But these theories really do not, they're not very convincing. I think the fact is, and there's plenty of evidence of that from Sanchi itself, and that is that the prohibition on handling money, which is very much there in the Pali texts, was not actually followed in practice. You were seeing the gap between theory and practice. And in fact, excavations under one of the monastic cells at Sanchi itself revealed a large number of coins and precious jewels and things like that. So clearly some monks who were living at Sanchi were in possession of abundant wealth. Something I'll come to a little later when I talk about Nagarjunakonda, but I want to just mention it here, and that is the issue of religious sentiments, which are also important when we're studying religious history, very important. A few inscriptions at Sanchi from the later period introduce the idea of the transfer of merit. And gifts are made, they're said to be made for the welfare and happiness of all beings, or for the attainment of the donor's nirvana. Now, these ideas about the transfer of merit not found in any Buddhist text. So again, huge gap between theory and practice. Just two more points I'd like to make about Sanchi before I move to Nagarjunakonda, and that is, in recent years, there have been studies of the hinterland of Sanchi, these studies have shown that there are many ancient dams or embankments in the Sanchi monastic area, in the hinterland, and suggesting that the Buddhist monks were actively involved in water harvesting, which may have been used for drinking purposes and also for irrigation purposes in the fields around them, because they would have also had land which they would have got other people to till for them. And there are dates now, ONS dates, from some of these dams, which indicate that these dams belonged to the late centuries BCE and after. So a connection between Buddhist monks on the one hand and water harvesting. The last point I want to make is this, that the time when the Sanchi monastery was sort of humming with activity, and the Buddhist monastery at Sanchi was growing in a massive way, was also the time when there was a beautiful Vishnu temple that was coming up, that had been built in Vidisha, close by. And one of the most interesting aspects of this temple is the fact that you have a pillar, which is known as the Heliodorus pillar, which records the gift made by a Greek, clearly a Greek ambassador of a Hellenistic king named Antiochus. And we are told that he had come to the court of a Shunga ruler named Bhagabhadra. And this king, this ambassador, Heliodorus, clearly a Greek name, describes himself as a Bhagavata, that is a worshipper of Vasudeva Krishna. So just to alert you to the fact that at many ancient sites, when you move away from a narrow focus to a wider focus, you find a very variegated kind of religious landscape in which there are multiple religious traditions which coexist. Now from Sanchi, we're going to go down south to another site that I'm very interested in and I've worked on, and that is Nagarjunakonda. In ancient times, and I'm talking about period now roughly between 250 to 325 CE. So this is a little after the early Sanchi inscriptions that I was talking about earlier. But we know that in the Krishna Valley, and Nagarjunakonda is somewhere here, there was, what was found here during excavations was a massive 15 square kilometer site, and the remains of the site range from the Stone Age to medieval times. This site was known in ancient times as Vijayapuri, and it was the capital of the Ikshvaku dynasty. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Ikshvakus, but they were ruling in this area in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. So it was a political center. And this is what the site looked like in the 20th century. Now, Nagarjunakonda's modern history is as exciting as its ancient history. The site was discovered in 1926 by this man, A.R. Saraswati. And it was excavated in the 1920s by a man named Longhurst and then Qureshi. And if you look at the various archaeological reports on Nagarjunakonda, you actually see unfolding before you the history of Indian archaeology, the changing perspectives that Indian archaeology had. So after its discovery, it was excavated in the 1920s, and the reports that were published at that time basically understood Nagarjunakonda as a Buddhist site. And very often, that is how this site is known even today. And there are active attempts to promote it as part of the Buddhist tourist circuit. It was excavated again in 1938 by T.N. Ramachandran. And for the first time, this report drew attention to the fact there were many Hindu temples in the ancient city. But when you read the report, and this should kind of be, I want to alert you to the fact that archaeology is not as, it's not hard empiricism. There is a lot of, you may find all kinds of other things mixed up with the data in archaeological reports. So interpretation, perspective, all these things are very important in archaeology as well. And in this report, the site was situated within the framework of regional history and the sentiment of the great Andhra people and Andhra pride, regional pride. Now, in the 1950s, plans were drawn for constructing a dam at Nagarjunakonda, or it was called the Nagarjuna Sagar project. And there was a very long and passionate parliamentary debate over this issue. The basic issue was that this was known to be a site with great historical importance, great importance when it came to heritage, but the dam that would be built would provide hydroelectric power and water for the farmers of Andhra. And this issue reached the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, and it was debated passionately. It was one of those, parliamentary debates in those days were different from what they are now. And ultimately, it was decided that development, electricity, irrigation, these things were more important. It was unfortunate that the site had to be destroyed, but too bad. So under the shadow of the impending submergence of the site, between 1954 and 1960, excavations were carried out at Nagarjunakonda under the direction of R. Subramaniam, and the report was published. Can you imagine? This is when the excavations were conducted, and the report was published in this year and this year. So you can see a huge time lag, and by then one wonders whether people remembered what had been discovered, and there's a lot of confusion actually in the reports. It's very difficult to interpret them because of all this. But let's not dwell too much on that. R. Subramaniam, because it's important when we talk about history and archaeology, it's important to think about the people who made these discoveries, who did this work, who unearthed these sites, and this is R. Subramaniam. This is what they found. Okay, in between 1954 and 60, massive excavation project, unprecedented in Indian history. Large-scale excavations. They found all those little dots that you see are the various structures that were discovered and documented. But when the dam waters, when the Krishna waters were finally flowed over the site was destroyed completely, forever. So this is a very strange, interesting, strange case of an archaeological site that was destroyed. Before being destroyed, it was documented. And some of the structures that existed at the site, 14 structures were selected, and they were transplanted on a hill in the valley. And when the Krishna river waters flowed after the dam became operational, that hill became an island. I don't know whether any of you have been to Nagarjunakonda. It's a very surreal experience because what you see is not the site at all. You're seeing a few transplanted structures on what looks like an island that was actually a hill, and everything else is gone. It's only there in the archaeological reports, which are very confusing. So this is what, there's a big stupa called the Mahachaitya that existed at Nagarjunakonda. This is what it looked like before excavation. This is the reconstructed stupa. You have to imagine a lot because there must have been a dome here, but this is all this brick base, and part of the dome was what was survived, and there were these 5 pillars known as Ayaka pillars, which are quite typically found in Andhra stupas, but not in all cases. So this was the reconstructed great stupa of Nagarjunakonda that was rebuilt on the island. And this is an imaginary reconstruction of what that Mahachaitya must have looked like when it was, in the 3rd and 4th century CE. So this is in the site museum. You can see the big difference. This was lined with carved limestone slabs, okay, which have become now detached and are in museums all over the world. Now, one of the many interesting things about Nagarjunakonda is that there is a lot of very deliberate architectural variety here. You have stupas, but there's so many different kinds of stupas. Again, remember, you have to imagine a dome on top of this. I'm just showing you photographs of the base. So you have rubble-based stupas. You have stupas which have 8 spokes in there. They're sort of built over a basic foundation of 8 spokes. There is a stupa which has a swastika inset. So there must have been some reason, I think deliberate experimentation, attempt to create a spectacular center of Buddhism in this city of Vijayapuri. This is an apsidal temple, that is a temple with a semicircular end, and you have, in this case, a chaitya or a temple with a stupa in the middle, and another, right opposite it is a temple with a Buddha statue. So you can see there's a lot of variety in architecture, in the kinds of temples or shrines that we have at this site. Remains of monasteries, of viharas have also been found here. Relics are of great interest to many people. They certainly were of great interest to the treasure hunters of the 19th century, the British military French and British military officers who tore into stupas all over the country. But a gold reliquary and relics were found in the Mahachaitya. And you find many different ways of interring or embedding relics at this site. Sometimes the remains of pots have been found inside the rims of stupas, and pieces of bone and things like that. The funerary remains of monks were placed here. You also find what are known as nestled reliquaries. That is, have you seen those little Russian dolls, one inside the other? This is a bit like that. So you have, outside it is made of, it is ceramic, within that stone, within that copper, then silver, and then gold. And the relics are right in the middle. So these nestled reliquaries. But one of the most intriguing finds, as far as relics are concerned at Nagarjunakonda, comes from this stupa 9. Of course, there was a water pot and food bowl, etc. But bones of a cow or bull were found in stupa 9. And you won't associate that with a Buddhist stupa, because Buddhism we associate with non-violence. And there's no textual support whatsoever for what might be animal sacrifice in a Buddhist context. So, gap between theory and practice. I'm going to sort of run through some of the slides so we have more time for discussion, but let me at least flag some of the other important aspects of this site. Monks who live here belong to many different schools, okay? So Bahushrutiya, Vajrayavadins, etc. And the variety in the school affiliation that you find at Nagarjunakonda is greater than that in any other historical site. Another point that the material evidence, archaeological evidence throws light on, which the texts don't tell you anything about, the everyday life of monks who lived at this site. So you have the pottery, the pots they ate in, you have strange objects, some kind of ritualistic, looks like some kind of fertility goddess figurine. You wonder what is she doing in a Buddhist context. You have copper sickles. The monks would not have probably done any agricultural activity themselves, but they must have hired labor, or they may have had slaves also to do the dirty work for them. And then, of course, you have something I don't have time to talk about, but the profusion of beautiful sculpture at the site, which tells you how artists in the 3rd and 4th century CE imagined the life of the Buddha. Now the inscriptions, let's do it very quickly, but remember what I said about Sanchi. Who were the donors at Nagarjunakonda? Not the kings. The Ikshvaku kings don't seem to have been interested in making donations to any religious establishment. Most of the gifts were made by women of the royal family, military commanders, and rich non-royal people. So again, the presence of kings is absent. Okay, so that's what we find. Let me just go over, to sort of jump over this. Basically, you have some very prominent women of the royal family making gifts. For instance, the sister of the first king, who was obviously a very influential woman, named Chanti Siri, and then there is another non-royal woman named Bodhi Siri, who made a very important contribution towards giving money towards the Vijayapuri monasteries. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of text on that slide, but if you sort of, let me just put it in 1 or 2 sentences, and that is that some of these inscriptions give us very long, what I call merit lists. For instance, there is this one inscription of a very affluent woman named Bodhisri, who made various gifts to the monasteries and the stupas in the area, and she lists 30 of her relatives by name and relationship, saying that the punya must go to these people. So the idea of the transfer of merit, very important in the Nagarjunakonda inscriptions. And again, this is something that the early Buddhist texts just are absolutely silent about, but this is clearly part of popular Buddhism. Another important point that we need to keep in mind is that Vijayapuri was a cosmopolitan Buddhist center. It seems that there were monks from various lands who came here. The monastery had connections with the Sri Lankan Sangha, and there's an inscription which tells us that a temple was built here for the benefit of monks from Tamraparni who had been involved in proselytizing activities in many, many lands, and we are given the names of the lands that these people came from. So Buddhism is not only an Indian concern. Gradually what's happening is it's becoming an Asian religion, and we get evidence of that. I'm going to just run through some images with you without talking about them, because I can see the clock is ticking. This is not just a Buddhist site. There are remains of many Hindu temples at Nagarjunakonda. I'm just showing you the ground plans. If you go there, you won't find what you would expect to find, a grand temple. You will only find the foundation walls. But we can then reconstruct what these temples may have looked like. So there are temples dedicated to Vishnu as Ashtabhuja Swamin. There are temples dedicated to Shiva as Sarvadeva. There is the Pushpabhadra Swamin temple. So several temples and lots of Hindu images found at the site. So the site was not only a Buddhist center, but there were many Shaiv temples, temples dedicated to Vishnu and Shiva, Kartikeya. These are the images that were found of a later period, by the way. Kartikeya, Ganesh, Durga. And there are also some medieval Jaina remains, but the Jain remains at the site are scarcely studied. So, Jain Tirthankar, perhaps, and then there are various remains of Nagas. And you know, Naga worship is one of the most important continuing elements in Indian religion, and many hero stones. So I think I'm coming to my conclusions. Yes, okay, good. So what I would like you to take away from this talk, I mean, this whirlwind tour from Sanchi to Nagarjunakonda, are some general points. One point is that archaeology, inscriptions, and visual sources, what we often call art, historical remains, are extremely rich sources for the history of religion. The history texts are important, but these sources are just as important. Many important ideas and practices, for instance, the worship of relics, the idea of the transfer of punya or merit, which by the way cuts across religious traditions. It's not only found in, I think you'll all find it, you will understand what it is, but because it's an idea that you find in many religious traditions, even today. So many important ideas and practices that are revealed through archaeology and inscriptions and to some extent visual sources are not discussed at all in religious texts. In fact, some of these practices are specifically prohibited. But people didn't read books and live their lives according to what the book said. We don't do that. So we should not be surprised that there is often a big gap between what the religious texts, which are prescriptive and normative, written by monks sitting somewhere in isolation, when people were doing things in whatever way they felt they wanted to. Now, Sanchi and Nagarjuna Konda display some similarities and several differences. I don't know whether you picked up on these, so I'll just highlight some of these. But before I say that, what I've been talking about largely is patronage, okay? The financing of religious establishments, and in this case, Buddhist establishments. So what patronage did was that it created communities of donors, monks, and merit recipients. And patronage knit these communities together. But membership of these communities varied from one site and one region to another. For instance, in the case of Sanchi, we saw monks and nuns being donors, appearing in large numbers as donors. At Nagarjuna Konda, you don't find monks and nuns as donors. In both cases, you find that, or in Sanchi, we found that royalty did not have any major role to play after Ashok's time in the expansion of the monastic establishments at Sanchi. But at Nagarjuna Konda, the Buddhist centers were very closely tied to royalty. And in fact, the fact that they declined soon after the end of the Ikshvaku dynasty is precisely because they depended to a large extent on the patronage of royalty. In both cases, you find women appearing as donors in a major way. So there are some similarities and there are also some differences. And if you do this kind of study for a number of sites across India, across the subcontinent during this period, you will find, again, some points of some medium ground and also some drastic differences. And the last point is the fact that when we look at the history of Buddhism, and I would say actually the history of India, or the Indian subcontinent, I should say, we often tend to be very myopic. We have history courses on the history of India and then courses on the history of other parts of the world. But it's very important to see Indian history, in my view, in relation to what was happening outside the subcontinent. And certainly, in the specific case of the history of Buddhism, the history of Indian Buddhist sites has to be situated within the context of evolving and expanding Asian Buddhist networks. And in fact, the very Buddhist sites that have a long lease of life, sites like Nalanda and Bodh Gaya, are the sites which become centers of pilgrimage and patronage across the Asian Buddhist world. So from Sanchi to Nagarjuna Konda, I tried to end this talk by pointing out that in order to understand Indian history, in order to understand Buddhism or Indian history better, actually we need to understand the connections, the connectivities between the subcontinent and other parts of Asia and Europe and Africa, because in many ways, these were interconnected worlds. So I'll stop here. I stop here and be happy to take questions.
Yeah, I guess there's some water there for you. We can have questions from the audience. Do we have a mic for people? So that you could hear. And I'll stop sharing this so that see this on screen.
This was the
Troublemaker. Troublemaker, yes. But then we can actually see the questions if somebody has questions on chat.
Sure.
So people on Zoom can type questions there. We also have YouTube Live. There might be questions there. So
You can take, unless there are questions about the images, maybe we can keep the PowerPoint on if there are any questions about the images, but otherwise it's up to you.
Very interesting insight about the stupas is one comment I see, but not a question. All right, so I guess we'll check on Zoom if there are questions.
May I ask you a question? Do you learn any ancient Indian history in ISER or past? No, in school you got forced to, I know. But do you learn any ancient Indian history in ISER or past? Okay, then you should have lots of questions.
The script in Sanskrit before was written in Brahmin script.
Correct.
So it didn't have any, like it's not like key for the decipherment of this.
Okay, so that's a good question, but I was talking about the inscriptions and I didn't tell you about the script or the language.
I'm a linguist.
Okay, so the script is Brahmi, and Brahmi, of course, it evolves over time. So the inscription of the earlier inscriptions at Sanchi is different, and Kushan period and Gupta period is different. The script of the Nagarjuna inscriptions is also Brahmi, but it is an ornamental form of Brahmi. That's why there are all those flourishes. So that's another interesting kind of evidence of experimentation that we can see at Nagarjuna. And the language of the earliest inscriptions is Prakrit, these days referred to as Middle Indic, with some Sanskrit elements. And from the early centuries CE, pardon?
Pali.
No, it's Prakrit or Middle Indic and Sanskrit. And as we move forward in time, the Sanskrit elements increase, and then the later inscriptions are in Sanskrit.
Yeah, I have two questions actually. One is about Sanchi itself. So around Sanchi, there are other sites with a lot of stup. So like Sarumaru, Bhojpur, Satthara, Sonali, and all. So what might be the reason behind the popularity of Sanchi and not these places? Is it like some aesthetic reason or historical reason or something like that? So that's my first question. And the second question is, in Nagarjunakonda, you showed that Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist, all three religious structures can be found. So were these constructed simultaneously, or was there some sort of overlap, or maybe some sites were taken over like that in Ellora? So yeah, these are my two questions.
Okay. And I do hope that all of you have been to Sanchi. All of the students have been to Sanchi. They're not nodding very vigorously. Yeah, okay, good. All right. So, you know, it is one of the sites which has been most thoroughly studied. Okay, but you're right that there are many other sites in the area. So, Sadhara or whatever. And in 1851, when Alexander Kalinam and Macy went around, from that time onwards that we have known about the existence of multiple or many centers of Buddhism in early historic central India. Sanchi has been most thoroughly studied and excavated, but it was also, I would think, one of the largest and most long-lived Buddhist centers at this time. Now, you might ask why. Is that so? Now, the reasons why some centers, religious centers, become more popular than others, and what is the history of their rise and decline, that is not something that I can answer in 5 minutes. But I think both in the case of Sanchi and also Narajan Kunda, the prestige and the popularity and the draw of pilgrims and donors to the site must have to a large extent depended on the relics that were enshrined in the stupas. In stupa number 1, no relics were found, much to the disappointment of Alexander Cunningham, who tore 2 trenches, vertical, horizontal, through the stupa, trying to find relics. He didn't find any there. But Sariputta, Mahamogalan, these are celebrated monks. And although, remember, in a stupa, it's not like a temple where you go and you see the image of the deity. Here, these are relic caskets that are embedded in the core of the stupa. Nobody can see them. You can just circumambulate. You can go around the stupa. But people must have known that the sacred relics of these great monks are enshrined here. And that would have led to the great popularity that was achieved there. And also in the case of Narajan Kunda, the Mahachaitya, it is believed had a relic of the Buddha, a bone relic of the Buddha. There's an inscription that suggests that. So that must have been the reason for the celebrity status that some of these sites achieved. And then, of course, the patronage and the support and the enthusiasm and the reverence and the piety of people who lived in the area around. I think that also made a significant difference.
Can we take a couple of questions from Zoom and then we can do that? Do I need the mic or?
Better to have the mic.
Yeah, better to have it, I guess. Yeah. So I'll read out both questions, I guess, together, and they're different. One is from Gunjan about, what should be the criteria to protect such archaeological sites? And does renovation damage the monuments and sites to a certain extent? So that's the first question. And the second question is from Sandeep, which is economics. What was the source of income for monks and nuns, and how did they finance the donations? Which I think you mentioned, but it'd be good.
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't answer the second question.
Was there? Yeah, okay, sorry.
No. I'll just quickly answer the second question, because at Narayan Kunda, the temples that I mentioned are contemporary to the Buddhist stupas, and then some of the temples live on. I mean, some of the religious structures are post the decline of the Buddhist establishments, and we don't know very much about Jain temples. They're probably later. So chronologically, there is some overlap, but the Buddhist centers come to an end, and the Hindu temples that we see, and also the Jain traditions, they have a long lease of life. Now, coming to the questions on Zoom, again, very complex issue. Traditionally, the policy of the ASI from early times, from the time of John Marshall at least, when conservation became a major issue, was conservation and not renovation and not restoration. Okay, there are differences. And I think, one of the things I love about going to ancient sites in India is that you get a sense of the oldness of the structures, or they're sort of the walls may be crumbling and the stupas or the temples may be incomplete, but you get a sense when you go there that you are entering in a very ancient place, unlike China where everything looks new, because they just redone everything and repainted and redone everything. So it should be conservation. It should not be restoration. It should certainly not be renovation, but actually you do find examples where structures that are supposed to be restored have actually been renovated. So I think that really goes against the principles, at least that informed the ASI in the early years. So there are certain departures. The second one, sources of income. So, these monks, obviously, or let me say not monks individually, some of them may have had money. And by the way, there is some report of a coin minting apparatus having been found at Narayan Kunda, suggesting that some monks may have been producing forged coins, but the details are not there. But so maybe we shouldn't ask as Persians, but we should not be surprised, okay? Because we have this idea about the typical Buddhist monk based on the texts that we read. But what monks were really like, well, that's another story. Many of these monasteries received land grants. They received money from donors because once the monks settled down, once the monasteries came up, they needed money from rich supporters, not only from rulers, as we have seen in some cases in Sanchi. It's not kings and queens who are giving donations, but people who had the means and who had the devotion to donate. And they also got land grants. So there is one land grant at Sanchi, and that records a donation made at the time of the Gupta king, Chandragupta II, by a military commander named Amrakar. So gradually over time, Buddhist monasteries, like many religious establishments we see in our own day, became very rich, okay, in terms of money and also in terms of land resources. And then they had to manage all this money and manage all the land. So that's another story.
So I have a question regarding the Shakti Stupa. I showed the female figures which are carved in the walls. Like I'm not talking about the donors, but the figures. So do you think there is a connection with these figures with the Tantric Buddhism?
Okay. So my answer to that question is no, because the period that we are looking at is long before, is much earlier than the development of Tantric Buddhism. But I can understand where your question is coming from, because I showed you some sculptures of the Buddha, okay, scenes from the life of the Buddha. Then you saw all these curvaceous female figures holding the branches of trees. There are also what are called Mithuna figures at this site and many others, loving couples, okay, who are embracing each other and having a good time. And there's a lot in the art of early Buddhist sites that is not specifically Buddhist at all. That is not religious. There are scenes from everyday life. And the depiction of amorous couples, Mithuna figures translated as amorous couples. You find them all over the place. And Nagarjuna, I showed you some, I don't know if you noticed. So these were seen as symbols of auspiciousness, the joys and the good things in life. And there was no contradiction that was seen between religious piety and the good things in life. Some of these figures, for instance, there was a figure of that woman grasping the hands of a tree, would be seen or would be described as a Shala Bhanjika or a Yakshi. And there are lots of Yakshas and Yakshis in these Buddhist sites because the worship of these Yakshis connected with fertility beliefs was very, very widespread all over the country. So the reason why you find so much feminine imagery of this particular kind has to do with the Yakshis, connection with the fertility cult. We also saw what is clearly Lakshmi. So the divine feminine is appearing here. So, and women as part of these Mithuna figures, which represent auspiciousness and fertility and the joy of life.
So, as there were some figures which were not specifically Buddhist, so are such figures also present in like monuments or temples of other religions, which are not specific to those religions? Or was it specifically Buddhist and the influence at that time that led to these figures in Sanchi or so?
So for students who have not been studying ancient history, all of you have some very pertinent questions, excellent questions. The answer is yes. When we talk about Buddhism, Jainism, Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Shakti worship, we're dividing religious history and religious traditions into different compartments, and we forget that they actually coexisted. Now, this coexistence need not necessarily always have been harmonious, but they coexisted and they drew on a common pool of symbols. Take the lotus. You will find the lotus in Buddhist sites, you will find it in Hindu temples. It's important as a symbol of fertility and purity. And one of the things that you should look out for this next time you go to Sanchi, John Marshall pointed out, John Marshall's this study called The Monuments of Sanchi. If you want to read more about Sanchi, read John Marshall's The Monuments of Sanchi, which describes the structures and describes the sculptures. And by the way, that volume is dedicated to the Begum of Bhopal, Begum Sultan Jahan, because she's the one who gave the money for the excavations, for the publication, and she's the one who gave the money for making the site museum also. So these Begums of Bhopal were actually very interesting women, very learned. The mother, Shah Jahan Begum, wrote a history of Bhopal. So completely going against the stereotype of a conservative Muslim ruler. They were really interested in Sanchi, and they gave money to show their interest. And they fought to have the relics brought back to Sanchi from the British Museum. But that's another story. But take the lotus. John Marshall says that there are over 800 lotuses at Sanchi. No two lotuses are alike. So there's a lot of artistry and skill and artistic genius that you see at sites like this. And remember the craftsmen who made these different, who worked at these sites. They were not divided into according to religion. All right, so you will find certain similarities in style, certain common motifs, particularly motifs associated with auspiciousness, cut across different religious traditions.
Another Zoom question on this. Okay, ask, then I'll ask my Zoom question. Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Hello, ma'am. So when you mentioned about Nagarjuna Konda, so it was from 250 BCE to I think 330.
It is CE. Okay, now historians, instead of saying BC and AD, now we say BCE, before Common Era, and CE, Common Era. So Nagarjuna Konda is around 250, I'm always very bad at dates, 250 to 350 CE, that is AD. It's later.
Yeah, so while mentioning that, you also mentioned how some of the Hindu temples were also found. And I think some of idols were also found along with that. So, like, do you think that Buddhism in certain ways influenced Hinduism, like especially with relation to idol worship? Does it have any connection? And second is, what is the afterlife of Buddhism? Like, after like 250 CE is quite like after Hinduism, let's say. Like when I visited Darjeeling, so there I found that there are certain things in Buddhism, especially the daily life or the daily rituals that is practiced in Buddhism, is quite similar in certain ways with Hinduism. So do you think there is some connection, or do you think Buddhism has influenced Hinduism in certain ways?
Okay, good question. So the dates for the Ishvakus are 250 to 325 CE, okay, to be precise. Now, you see, the reason why we're asking these questions is that when we think about religion these days, we tend to think in terms of monolithic religious categories, okay, discrete monolithic religious categories, and we divide people up according to their religious beliefs or the families in which they happen to be born into Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Jains, etc. Now, the time that we are looking at, this is one of the most exciting periods for this reason, is that you have these religious traditions in the making. It's a very formative stage. And it's not a time where you have the kinds of rigid religious boundaries that we're used to seeing in our own time did not exist at that time. So it's, what did it mean? I mean, did a person who made a gift to the Sanchi establishment, let's say, provided she was not he or she, a member of the laity, did he or she think of themselves as a Buddhist in terms of identity? And religious identities, I think at that time were much more fluid. And image worship, I prefer to use the term image worship rather than idol worship, because idolatry, it has certain connotations. So what's happening is that there is a representation of divinity and of saints and teachers in iconic form. Okay, so images are found of the Buddha, various bodhisattvas, of the Jain Tirthankaras, and you have images of Vaishnav images. You have Durga, we saw Lakshmi, Shiva, Buddhimalam, Linga goes back to around 200 BCE. So image worship is becoming prevalent, increasingly popular across the board, cutting across religious traditions. And of course, they were influencing each other, because the people who financed these monuments, the people who sort of espoused or were followers of these different religious traditions, again, we're looking at people who were intermingling traditions that were formative and were not as rigidly divided as they are today. So certainly there is a kind of influence across religious traditions, cross-fertilization, there's religious dialogue, there is also religious competition for patronage, and also in some cases we see evidence of religious conflict. By the way, Stupa number 1, which was built in the time of Ashok, and there's clear evidence of that, there was evidence of wanton damage. This is the phrase that was used by John Marshall. He said there is evidence of extensive, wantonly inflicted damage on the body of Stupa number 1, of the Ashokan brick stupa. And he suggested that it was Pushyamitra Shunga. The Shungas followed the Mauryas as rulers of Magadha, that the Shungas may have engaged in religious persecution, and that it may have been Pushyamitra who was responsible for the damage inflicted on the stupa. So, what we are talking about is important. It is how different groups of people, the kinds of people, I mean, I just talked about some of them today, how they saw themselves, what are the religious terms, how they define themselves in terms of religiosity. And my feeling is that it's not in the rigid, monolithic ways in which we look at religion today, or at least I hope so.
Should I ask one question from Zoom and then get it back to the audience? Yeah. Is it on? Something. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so this one is a bit more technical. So, like Agama rules for Hindu temples, do Buddhist shrines follow any particular set of architectural rules? So, this is from Marudhan Gangadharan.
Architectural rules. Well, what I can say, and I can say it on the basis of what I talked about today, and that is that there is considerable architectural variation in the shape of stupas. If you remember those slides that I zoomed through at the end, Nagarjunakonda itself, in one side, you have stupas with different kind of ground plans, though they may have looked the same from outside, but must have been some reason why some of them had a swastika instead, some had spoked wheels, so on and so forth. I don't know if you noticed the pillars. There were some stumps of 5 pillars in that at the 4 cardinal directions of the Mahachaitya at Nagarjunakonda. Those are known as Ayaka pillars. They're only found in Andhra. So the Sanchi Stupa is probably what most of you think about when you think of a stupa. The concept of the stupa is the same when you go to various parts of India or even outside the subcontinent, but the architectural form of the stupa is different. So if you look at Sarnath and the Dhamek stupa, it's a huge dome, very different from the hemispherical dome that you see at Sanchi. And other details such as the icons. And if you look at the stupas in other parts of Asia, the Sri Lankan stupas, or look at the payas that you see in Myanmar or in Thailand, the idea of the stupa is similar, but the architectural form that the stupa takes varies considerably.
Thank you. Ma'am. Here. When I went to Sanchi, I realized that many of the body parts of
Many of the body parts
Buddha statues were missing. Is it the same in Nagarjuna? Another one more doubt. So these days, I find that many of my friends are moving from their religion and tattooing Buddha or having Buddha images in their room, not always knowing the history of Buddhism or not. But Buddhism is becoming quite fashionable among the youth now. So why do you think that is?
Okay, interesting questions. Well, you're looking at images that were made how many? 2000 plus years ago, give or take a century or two. So it's not surprising that they're not in pristine, perfect condition. I mean, just think about it, and it's stone. So there is what might be called natural wear and tear. There is the kind of damage that might happen when a site or a monastery ceases to be occupied. See, that's the other question. Why did these monasteries decline, and why did they come to an end? And if once they were abandoned, one imagine that some of the damage would have happened then. And then there is also deliberately inflicted damage. I mean, if you go around the museums of the world, you will see lots of Buddha heads. And when people were, and this goes back to the 19th century, even people like Alexander Cunningham, they were interested in Buddhism and archaeology, but they actually damaged many of the stupas that they excavated. And similarly, you will find bodies without heads, heads without bodies, because when treasure hunters or art collectors wanted to cart things off from sites to museums, it was often difficult to cart the whole thing off. So for instance, in Mathura, you have very famous images of Kushan emperors. They're headless. So I wonder where the heads are. I mean, so there are many, many different reasons that are responsible for the damaged condition of these old images. So, and one can do studies about these various sites and what happens to them. The modern histories of these sculptures, of these sites, to my mind, it makes very interesting subject for study. Now, as far as the popularity of Buddhism today, Buddhism has certainly established, it's got a sort of celebrity status. I think it has to do with the certainly media, Dalai Lama, a lot of famous actors, Richard Gere, so many Hollywood stars. I do have a hunch, although I personally also find Buddhism very attractive, but I find early Buddhism attractive, Buddhism of the early texts. Tibetan Buddhism is, the Dalai Lama represents Tibetan Buddhism that has acquired a certain amount of popularity among the urban intelligentsia. I don't know to what extent people who feel an affinity or interest in Buddhism know enough about it. I think that's something that is desirable. I mean, if you have certain affinity or attraction towards a religious tradition, then it's a good idea to find out more about it.
Hello, ma'am. So I had this question that no matter we do understand that that Buddhism did forego the caste system that is practiced by Hinduism. So and that so what can we talk about? So how can we? I mean, what do you have to say about the caste system if it did exist in these temples or did not? I mean, in these shrines.
Okay, so I'll answer your question in a very general way, and that is that there is this stereotypical notion that Buddhism was anti-caste and it was against any kind of social inequality. And though that idea comes more from, I think, our Ambedkarite understanding of Buddhism and the role that Buddhism has played for that it's in modern India. Okay, it has become a religion that those who have been marginalized and oppressed for centuries have converted to and have espoused. So that is one interpretation of Buddhism, which is tied to social inequalities in modern times. But if you look at the early Buddhist texts, if you look at the earliest Buddhist texts in the Pali, the Tipitaka is what we have, what you find is that Buddhism actually it's not calling for an abolition of all social inequality. To a large extent, I won't say that will not state mine. To some extent, the Buddha accepted social inequalities. For instance, slaves could not join the Sangha unless they were freed from their masters. Debtors could not join the Sangha unless their creditors told them, okay, you can go and join. So there was a certain, and by the way, the Buddha himself is shown as having hobnobbed with a lot of the powerful politicians of the time, the kings. Okay, so it had close connections with rulers, with elites. There is a certain acceptance of social inequality. Social inequality disappears theoretically only once you join the Sangha. So the Sangha, the monastic order, was like an island of equality. All monks were theoretically supposed to be equal. But this island of equality existed within a larger society in which inequality was rampant. But the Buddha never sought to eradicate inequality. He didn't want to change the world. He was talking about an inner transformation, a realization of the nature of suffering and the way in which suffering could be removed. So those are, I think, the main concerns that you see in early Buddhist philosophy. So caste existed at that time. We consider it having come into existence in about the 6th century BCE. There is a sense of high and low in Buddhism. We find that almost all the major Buddhist monks were either Brahmins or came from Kshatriya families. So there is an upper class kind of background bias, even within the Sangha, where theoretically everybody is supposed to be equal.
Upinder, fascinating talk, and I have a list of questions, but I'll ask one question, which is related to the methodology that got me excited, the methodology of archaeology and the kind of history that you presented. Largely to do with historical explanation or archaeological explanation and the role of evidence. Some of the things, what fascinated me is that, like, the skeleton of a bull or a cow in a monastery, or second, the thing that you mentioned, that in a monastery some pearls were found. Now, from that interesting evidence now that we have, how does archaeology go about doing its theory? Now, what is interesting here is that we can just say that this skeleton of a cow or a bull is just one of a thing. It's a contingent possibility that could have happened. Cow was there and it died there, something. And now from that, to make it into an interesting explanation, interesting theory, which requires some amount of going from this individual evidence to a higher collective evidence, the collective theory in that sense, how it played a larger role in that. How does archaeology does it, or history does it? Because the problem here is that contrast to that of, like, say, natural sciences, where there is abundance of evidence. If I take one mineral, copper or something, I can replicate it in 1,000 times. and it's the same evidence, will same theory will explain that. But seems to be the case that history struggles and archaeology struggles with exact opposite, which is poverty of evidence. But I don't want to put it as poverty of evidence. The problem here is that of evidence being prized evidence, where one coin has the owners, has to take the burden of explaining everything that is happening at that particular time. I mean, I feel very sad for that coin. It has to do the whole explanation or the skeleton. Now, how does history and archaeology functions with it, works with it?
Okay, interesting question. So again, a lot depends on the questions that the historian or archaeologist asks of the evidence. And by the way, don't feel sorry for the coins, because almost everything we know about the Indo-Greeks, for instance, is based on those coins. So what I mean is, for the historian or the archaeologist, all traces of human activity in the past are potent with possible meaning. And the meanings that emerge from it, I don't think there is one theory. There are multiple methodologies that are used in order to pose different questions and also then extract different kinds of answers. So for instance, in the case of Sanchi, the art historian, I think art historians are also historians, will be talking about analyzing the style of the sculptures. The epigraphist will be focusing on the evolution of the script and the language. The historian like me will be looking at what the inscriptions say and try to integrate it into the larger archaeological landscape. The study that I mentioned earlier, it's talking about Sanchi, its larger hinterland, and is looking at the water management system that was, and trying to use scientific techniques which are being used in a more and more in a big way in archaeology even in India. So I don't think I'll be able to answer your question with a simple answer, because there's just so many different within the discipline of history. For instance, the way in which I approach my sources as a historian of ancient India is very different from, let's say, a colleague who's working on medieval manuscripts or a colleague who's working in the archives. So I think we all see these as sources of history which are potent, which are laden with possible multiple meanings. But I think we are also very, very conscious of the fact that it's not just an empirical exercise that we're engaging in, that our own perspectives and the questions we are asking are influencing the results of our investigations in a major way. And I'm saying that because sometimes it's thought that archaeology is a hard science, and it's becoming increasingly scientific, but interpretation is crucial. And the questions that are asked are crucial. So Purana Kila, are you going to look for the proof of the Mahabharata events having happened, or are you going to look for the oldest evidence that we have of occupation and see the development and evolution of structures and technology and so on and so forth? So your question is a very tough one. And I think it's an important question. It's not easy to give a satisfactory answer that takes into account the multiplicity of perspectives and methods that exist today within the fields of history and archaeology. Yes.
So I think we take just a couple more questions, because I think we're nearing 6:30 and
I'm fine.
yeah, if you're fine.
The students may be.
No, they seem to all be excited.
Okay.
But I don't want to
Yeah,
tire you out.
so things must be okay.
We have read about
Can you switch on the mic? Because
So we have read about this Kunda's meal, Kunda's Kumarapattan meal that was given to Buddha before he died, and it was a tainted pork. So in the scriptures, it is nowhere mentioned in Buddhism itself that you need to have a non-vegetarian food. But according to the Theravada tradition, they suggest that Buddha actually ate pork, a tainted pork, and then he died. So there was a difference between, like as you mentioned, about the idea of theory and practice. And the second question is, like,
you showed us the picture about this dam that was constructed after the destruction of the site. But and that didn't become a political question in the Indian subcontinent. Now, if you look at when Bahmian Buddhism was, the ideas of Buddhas were destroyed in Afghanistan by Mullah Umar. So when Mullah Umar actually destroyed the Buddhas, he said that I'm destroying this because this has become a source of aesthetic experience for the people coming from West. And Afghanistan was in a very different situation at that time. So, but in that situation, it became a very political question, the destruction of the Bahmian Buddha. And it became a global, political question that it was, and it was given a particular religious color. But when it happened in India, for example, the ASI destroyed, like it is nowhere mentioned. Like people don't really talk about this idea, like why this excavation of this destruction of the site happened in India. So,
well, I've written an article on the Nagarjuna Konda, the modern story, and it goes up to debates in Parliament, in which Nehru also, participated, so on and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, because there is this Afghanistan, the Taliban. I mean, these are issues that are, which arouse a lot of concerns and strong views on various kinds. And certainly, here you had, in the case of Nagarjuna Konda, there was a discussion, and there was development versus heritage. And by the way, this happens all the time, isn't it? When you build a metro or a railway line, or unfortunately, we do not have a kind of archaeological team, so we don't know what was found underground when the Delhi metro was built. I mean, so there was also or when the Aravalis are being mined, the destruction of heritage goes on all the time. So these are very spectacular and very heavily publicized events of destruction. And I think the motives of the destruction also made them, and the structures that were destroyed, the Buddha images that were destroyed have been recognized as, had great archaeological and religious significance. So it was a very spectacular, in-your-face destruction. In the case of Nagarjuna Konda, okay, all this happened in the 50s, long before you were born. And I wouldn't be surprised even if your parents don't remember this. I mean, it's a site that is not as prominent in the public, as far as public awareness or consciousness is concerned. But when you read the debate, you realize that people are really feel terrible about having to do this. And there are these MPs from Andhra who say, look at these starving Andhra farmers. Okay, they need electricity, they need water. So it wasn't as though let's destroy this site, and just finish it off because it's a nuisance, or we don't like it, or we don't like the Buddhist structures or whatever. It was really a very painfully worked out kind of decision where heritage was in conflict with modernization or development. Now, your first question, I like that question because, a lot of people think that Buddhism means vegetarianism. That's not true. There's plenty of evidence. I mean, monks today in different parts of the world, the Dalai Lama has said that, look, I eat meat. I mean, there are monks who live in areas where you don't get sabzi easily, so you have to eat meat. And he said he struggled and he's tried to become vegetarian, but it's very difficult. And you look at other parts of Asia also, in Burma, etc., you will find meat-eating, fish-eating monks. And the Buddha himself was clearly not a vegetarian. Chunda, who was a blacksmith, Buddha's last meal is supposed to have been in the house of Chunda. He was offered something. Of course, Buddhists will debate whether it was some mushroom or something else, because some people find it awful, horrible thought that the Buddha could have eaten meat or pork or whatever. But it's fairly, I think it's very clear it was some kind of meat. And that does not go against his teaching. Because according to the Buddha's teaching, when the monk goes on begging grounds, he is not supposed to refuse anything that he's offered. So as long as you know that the animal was not killed in order to give you a feast, a monk cannot refuse what is offered to him. So whether you're given dal or sabzi or chicken curry, as a monk or as a nun, you are obliged to accept it so that the merit of that can accrue to the person who has given it to you. So Buddhism does not, early Buddhism cannot be equated, non-violence, yes, but that does not necessarily mean vegetarianism.
I think this will have to be the last question because, yeah, we've run out of time and battery. So, okay. No, you ask a question. Last question.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for such an enlightening session. I have a question regarding this sculptural structures in this Sanchi. And as in my reading, I read like Ashoka was the one who patronized Hinayana Buddhist.
Okay, finish your question and
Then what about the structure after, how it is possible or what are, of course there will be some rift between people like constructing Buddha statue and all.
Okay.
Please tell me something
Okay.
about it.
So again, very briefly, because I've been told that the battery is running out.
You can answer this completely. Just
Okay, I will answer it, but I'll answer it as succinctly as I can. What you are referring to is something that's referred to in the school textbooks as a split in that took place in the Buddhist Sangha around this time, around the turn of the millennium, the period that I was talking about, let's say around the early centuries CE or AD, between Hinayana and Mahayana. Now, these terms are actually were coined by the so-called Mahayanists, because lesser Vedical, who would call themselves as lesser Vedical, right? So that these terms are not generally used today, but by scholars of Buddhism, certainly. But certainly there are various changes that are taking place within Buddhism at the level of philosophy. There are different philosophical schools that are emerging, which we know about, and also at the level of practice, religious practice. So the stupas were around. The Pali texts talk about stupas being erected for great kings of kings. And the Buddha is supposed to have told his disciple Ananda, when he knew he was going to die after he ate that bad meat at Chunda's house. He said that I'm going to die, and after I'm gone, you must erect a stupa over my remains, as the kind of edifices that are erected over the remains, the bodily remains of the King of Kings. So clearly there is this older tradition, but it's really from probably at the time 6th and 5th century BCE, there was a tradition of mud stupas being built, but the structures that we can identify, brick structures, belong to and begin and increase from Ashok's time. So this is well before that all those changes that are referred to as the Mahayana elements come in. Okay, so you will find stupas being venerated from certainly they're being built after the Buddha's time. They are popularized, increase in numbers in Ashok's time. They increase and they continue to be venerated even later when other changes come into Buddhism, when you have the emergence of Buddhist Tantra, so on and so forth. But the changes, you have pointed out an important change, and that is, I couldn't show it to you, that there is the kind, and this connects with the other question about the images, that there is a kind of transition that you see at these sites between the representation and veneration of the Buddha in an iconic form, that is in the form of symbols, either a throne or a people tree or footprints, to anthropomorphic form, that is in human form. And in Nagarjuna Konda, there's a very interesting pillar. One side of the pillar shows the Buddha in an iconic form, in symbolic form, and the other side he is shown in a human or anthropomorphic form. So this transition is happening. So there are many changes that are going on within Buddhism at the level of philosophical doctrines, at the level of religious belief and practice. And you can see these. The stupas are there at Sanchi, remember, from the 3rd century BCE to the 12th century. Things get added on. So in the early times, there are no Buddha, early sculptures. the Buddha images, gradually the images are found, and they are found in the temples, and there are so many images that belong to the Kushan and the Gupta periods.
I guess we can have the other questions outside of the talk. So thank you so much, Upinder. And as you can see, they're all excited with questions. In fact, I'm looking forward to seeing Sachi again.
Good. By the way, I'm going to Sanchi again, hopefully day after tomorrow. Because every time you go there, you see new things.
Yeah.